Okay, I think we're ready to go. So good afternoon to everybody joining us on our Wednesday webinar, weekly webinar, I should say, from BASIS, and that is the British Association for Sustainable Sport. We've got a terrific panel lined up today, which is going to be led and moderated by Dan Epstein. Dan is the former head of the Sustainable Development and Regeneration for the Olympic Authority back in 2012. And he's currently now director of the sustainability at the Really Useful Trust. I'll allow the speakers to introduce themselves, but just before I hand over to Dan, I wanted to quickly introduce you to BASIS for those who are attending who perhaps do not know who we are or what we do. So this is just a brief roundup. About 10 years ago we started, and it was with a fairly simple proposition of sharing best practice in sustainability within the sporting sector, and in particular venues at that time. We have since then broadened things out to embrace a wider sporting agenda, but our focus is in particular in the built environment within sport. If you go to our website, basis.org.uk, you'll find a lot more detail about the organisation and our vision, mission, and the principles that we operate by. I do want to share just a quick slide. Sorry, so it takes a little bit longer than you think. Which is it's a philosophical foundation around sport and sustainability, and it's important because it kind of puts sport into the context of the wider agenda of sustainability. And it's important, I think, to bear these in mind, and when you're thinking about sport and its place in the environment and its impact and the fact that it impacts on the environment. You also need to bear in mind that it provides a lot of very positive social and economic benefits, both to the wider community, but also to us as individuals. So really, we need to find that position for sport where it can be enjoyed, but its impacts are minimized and it's maximizing its social and economic benefits. I think one of the really important messages is that sport can act as a trusted ambassador. And we know that because sport engenders a huge amount of passion in the people who follow it, the people who read about it, the people who attend matches, and obviously the people who participate. So keeping that in mind, the title of this week's seminar, which is Design and Build in the Sporting Environment, and that's contained within a campaign that BASIS is leading to build back better in sport. And when you go on our website, you'll be asked to complete a really short survey. And I encourage you all to please do that, because the more input we get from as wide a church as possible, the more informed that survey will be. And the idea is that we're going to put that together as a white paper to then talk to government about how sport builds itself back better. Because it's a well-known fact that sport contributes, in the region of £39 billion to the UK economy. And that's a significant amount. And a large proportion of that comes from grassroots sport, of course. So the role sport has to play in the recovery from the pandemic, it's significant. It's the delivery of built assets and then spaces which are going to provide opportunities for recuperation in respect of mental and physical well-being. That's going to be vital. And in that wider rebuild and new build, it's going to encompass the repurposing of stadia, the rebuilding of stadia, building of new stadia, indoor and outdoor sporting facilities, both at grassroots level and local authority leisure facilities. It's a wide and varied estate, and we're going to be part of that. So BASIS wants to lead that argument, which promotes the principles of sustainable design and build, so that they can be at the forefront of that rebuilding. I'm sure you all know COP26 is a year away. And the good news, I suppose, is that with the election of Joe Biden, we hope it'll all be confirmed and we'll move ahead like it should. But both him and Boris Johnson have subscribed to the green recovery rationale, and both have talked about it in quite a lot of detail. And that's important, because if we're going to come in a positive way to COP26, then you need to have, certainly the leader of the free world in tune with that. BASIS hopes to, or BASIS will be at COP26, and we'll be delivering at that seminar, at the summit, sorry, and that's important for us, obviously, to make sure that we're representing sport in the best way. So it does, as I say, give us the optimism for the green recovery, and hopefully it'll become a reality, and not, as one politician said, just a whiff-waff. So just to wrap up, I'd like to leave you with a quote, and this is credited to somebody called Buckminster Fuller, and it's in Sophie Rayworth's book, Donut Economics, and I thought it was very apt for today. So it goes, you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. So I'll leave you with that, and I'll pass over to Dan.
Thanks, Chris, and welcome everybody. Great audience. I can see sort of over almost 60 people. Fantastic. I'm going to do two things. I'm going to moderate the session. I'm going to quickly introduce our three speakers, and then I'm going to do a little bit of a kind of an overview and then hand over to the speaker. So Eva McNamara, who's an engineer at Expedition Engineering, has got a huge amount of experience both in stadium, but also in kind of arts and culture and sort of various other areas of sort of structural engineering. And I think she's going to kind of talk to us about many of the kind of innovative things we can do from a structural and an engineering perspective. Then we've got Jonathan at GCP Architects, who's going to take a very different perspective, really look at kind of existing stock and how we might kind of build that back better. And then Vicky Aston, who's at the Vale of Whitehorse and South Oxfordshire District Councils, is going to talk maybe about the kind of way in which planning can facilitate a build back better. By way of background, I mean, I suppose in response to Chris's kind of little introduction, I think the first thing we need is a really good locksmith to kind of, so we can remove the existing president and maybe a broom as well, so we can, bring in a new broom, but bring in kind of the new president and hopefully massive change, which is, I think, what we all kind of need. By way of background, so I was the head of sustainable development and legacy for the Olympics. So I was on that London 2012 BBC programme that any of you might have seen. I was that woman who was never sure whether she was the head of legacy or sustainability or what either of them meant anyway. So, and actually the weird thing about that was that I took, for example, a group of German visitors around the Olympic Park, and the next week there was a group of German visitors on the bus in London 2012 programme. So they didn't tell any of us, but they were actually kind of following us and then building that into the programme. It was rather, if it hadn't been a success, it'd been incredibly embarrassing. I've also spent time with the IOC and as a consultant working on the Rio Olympics, and then in Beijing, Seoul and Sochi, kind of looking at and helping those games, for better or for worse, try to deliver a sort of sustainability legacy. But I kind of spend most of my time nowadays looking at large regeneration projects around the UK. I'm really interested in actually the overall theme we're exploring, sort of sustainability, sport, construction and sustainable facilities, I think is kind of really fascinating. We're not just focusing on those. I think we really need to kind of look at the whole life cycle of these. And I think this is something that Jonathan will bring out, the whole life cycle of sports facilities. It's a bit of a shocker, I think, how many, I mean, I've got two kids. and we take one of them around to swimming events, and just the number of rundown swimming pools, I think, is a bit of a shocker. And yet the number of kids who turn up at these events, I mean, literally hundreds of kids at these swimming events, and yet we're kind of in really substandard, using really substandard facilities often. So I think there is a huge challenge to rethink all of this. And I think COVID has really shone a light on the importance of activity, the outdoors sports facilities in community and health. I think it's really an amazing kind of moment, actually, to kind of take a pause and work with basis on kind of what the future might look like. I think it's shown what a huge demand there is for gyms, pools, sports halls, fields, even as demand for office and retail facilities has sort of gone into rapid decline, largely as a result of technology. So as we begin to think back what the centre of our towns might look like, there's a huge cultural component, but I think there's also a really big green space and sports component to all of that. I mean, certainly my park, I live in London, is absolutely rammed, even at the moment, on a decent day, people are sort of flooding to it. You can just sort of see the need to get out and to commune and to exercise, and just the importance of facilities within our environment. So if we're going to build back better and make the most of this reappraisal, the kind of moment that we have to kind of rethink the importance of sport and health as part of, I think, what everybody's sort of terming now the 15-minute city or the 15-minute neighborhood, a place that provides everything within a 15-minute walk, a network of self-supporting neighborhoods. We need new and better strategies, I think, for managing, maintaining, as well as building new venues and venues and assets. So I think that's a really big part of all of this, actually thinking about, how do we actually kind of build really robust, easy to maintain, low cost, high value buildings and facilities. I think for too long, we just haven't really thought about the long-term maintenance, and you kind of see buildings that have to be repaired really rapidly. Our local swimming pool is a kind of a point in case. In fact, it had to be repaired before it was even opened. I think it's because we haven't really kind of understood how to do this sort of brilliantly. Our existing facilities are often kind of run down, as I said, and in a poor state of repair. And I think that's a combination of poor design and build, poor maintenance and management, huge demand actually for these facilities, which I think creates loads of wear and tear, and then a lack of funding. And it's kind of fascinating. When I was on the Olympics, we were looking around the world at what other major cities had, and we were trying to decide which of the venues we build should be legacy venues, do we want to keep, and which ones don't we want to keep. We didn't get it all right. I mean, clearly West Ham Stadium was designed to be, or the Olympic Stadium was designed to be taken down. It became West Ham Stadium. But what we did discover was that, for example, with swimming, that there were virtually no international quality swimming pools in London, yet they had 50 in Paris. It's really the paucity of facilities was really sort of clear actually at the time. A part of the promise was actually of the legacy was to address that. So this perhaps is a kind of a chance to kind of do that properly. I'd argue that we need to build a case for new and higher levels of investment, including mapping. So I think it starts by mapping all of our facilities, and their current condition, evaluating and publishing the sort of economic, social, and kind of health value that they contribute, and then developing an inventory of shovel-ready, because the government is looking for shovel-ready projects that we can kind of invest in, but we do it kind of really well. And I think you'll see later on the kind of some of the ideas about how we might kind of do that better. In addition, I think we need to build new coalitions and partnerships between local authorities, Sports Council, Sports England, and the community, if we're going to do this. I mean, I'm often kind of surprised. I sort of sit on the outside of this sort of sports world, but how siloed it is, how individual sports groups are kind of are really vying for their own. And we saw this again on the Olympics, are kind of vying for their own venues, their own sort of stadiums. I think Jonathan might kind of pick up on some of that. So if we're going to be beyond this, and in order to ensure that we can afford to maintain our sports facilities, I think we need to develop a really clear set of sustainability guidelines. We need to build to last, for example. Too often we build for cost, and I think as a result we kind of The performance is poor. The kind of robustness isn't there. We need to provide, for me, for natural light and good ventilation to keep the kind of energy costs down, if for no other reason, but also because it's part of a health agenda. We need to minimize heating and cooling by using thermal mass and insulation appropriately. We need to design buildings that can be washed down and cleaned really quickly and easily. How many changing rooms kind of just are really difficult to kind of to maintain. Our buildings need to sort of survive the test of time. They need to be really robust. They need to be well designed with great materials. We need to integrate low carbon solutions like free heating and cooling from local heat networks into kind of wider energy thinking, because often, these facilities are actually a fantastic anchor for heating and cooling. That might be free heating and cooling, that might be part of a kind of a wider community opportunity to decarbonize. We need to make sure that we're adopting technologies like backwash filtration and reuse of water to reduce possible water use. And waterless urinals. Again, on the Olympics, we were told none of this could kind of work, and yet all of our venues had it. And I'm still seeing kind of new venues being built that don't have these sorts of simple things that keep the cost down. We need to install, I would argue, sort of solar on the roofs, because in the long run, you're getting free power. So the capital costs, may be slightly higher, but actually they're kind of investable. And there are lots of other examples of things I think we can kind of do. So I think we really need a kind of a clear sort of set of requirements that we're going to kind of help, not just on the carbon agenda, but also on the cost maintenance, and financial kind of agendas, and then on the social agendas. How do we kind of build these things that are inclusive? So I was just going to show some very quick slides and then hand over. And these are taken from the Olympic Park. So I think everything kind of starts. I think let's sort of think big, and let's understand, sort of based on sort of Chris's initial kind of thoughts. Let's understand that it all starts with a framing. I think sport has to be really at the sort of center of a kind of an environmental and social and economic agenda for better placemaking. Some of the kind of things we did on the Olympic Park, we kind of totally transformed, the park itself, the green space, and that's incredibly important because the park itself is at the heart of, all of the facilities that we use, and including this piece of river, which is now, a really good part of the Lee Valley Rowing Club, which is incredibly sort of successful. This is what the river looked like. Before it was a dumping ground, that it had fridges, this fridge island on it, which is the site of the aquatics. And we turned it and transformed it into this fabulous kind of area, which is contributing both open space, green space, new cycle facilities, pedestrian facilities. It's connected, it draws people from all over the world. So it was really transformative. And that's an incredibly sort of important part of this, the sort of health and well-being agenda. And this is the backdrop for what I thought was a really successful Olympics, the park itself, the sort of great legacy. So where better to put great sporting facilities than in the middle of a fantastic, vibrant park? How do we kind of build so it's really lightweight? So this red outline is the Beijing stadium, which is an 80,000 seater stadium. The black outline is the Populous Stadium for London, which is also an 80,000 seater stadium, but used a quarter of the materials. So we know, and Eva will talk more about this, we know we can build in a much more lightweight, but also much more robust way. It costs far less. We also managed on the Olympics, and again, this is something that I really think we need to think harder about, is we required that 20% of all the materials we use would come from recycled sources. So here are some old gas pipes which were surplus to requirement, and they ended up being used in the ring beam and the exoskeleton for the Olympic Stadium. We reduced our carbon emissions and we reused materials, huge amount of materials. That was just innovation and good design. Here we designed a stadium, an aquatic centre with 17,500 seats. That's a requirement of the IOC. But afterwards, you look around the world and you only need 2,000 seats. So we designed it so that those two wings could be taken away, and they now are part of the whole events a whole events world where the seats are taken and used for temporary events, sporting events, other cultural events around the world. They were designed particularly for that. And this is what we end up with, a sort of a venue which is brilliantly used by the community. It's really hard over the last few months during COVID to book a place on the, to swim at the swimming pool because it's so popular. We designed our parts that we had to demolish buildings, but we reused 85%, 95% of the plus of the materials, and we actually reused 7 of those buildings. We basically took them down. They were built, one in Tanzania, a couple in Ireland, a couple around the country. We rebuilt those buildings, the portal frame buildings, and then we recycled lots of the material. We managed to reduce the embodied carbon in our concrete by 50%. Actually, here it's 42, but the final results were sort of even higher by using cement substitutes, etc. We managed to create a heat network that uses free heat from biomass to provide the heating and the cooling and the hot water to all the venues. And we used recycled water across the park. So all these sorts of innovations and many more actually were kind of part of a whole ethos around how we build in a really sustainable way. And I think the legacy is the beginning of a fantastic new neighborhood. Anyway, that was just really to get you kind of thinking. I'm now going to hand over to Eva to introduce herself and to give us the first presentation.
Hi everyone, I'm Eva McNamara from Expedition Engineering, and as Dan said, I've been working in low carbon design for a while, in particular actually in infrastructure, which is a really great place to start because they've got a huge amount of money to spend on innovation, and we can take all that learning and apply it to all these other industries. So I'm just going to share my screen with you now. Has that come up? Great. Okay, so just a bit of background about me and where I work. So for Expedition Engineering, but we're part of the Useful Simple Trust, and we're a family of professional design practices who are we're trying to drive change in the built environment, and we take a collaborative approach and use our creative design thinking to engage clients to deliver positively impactful outcomes. So we have committed engineers, architects, designers and strategists working in Expedition as engineers, Thomas Matthews as communication designers, Useful Studio as architects, Think Up in engineering education, and Useful Projects, which Dan is a director of, in sustainability consultancy. So importantly also, we're an employee benefit trust, social enterprise, and we're currently on the cusp of being a certified B Corp, and all of these things influence the way in which we work. So what's the problem? So Dan's covered quite a lot of this already, so I'm just going to pick up on a few points here. So what does business as usual look like? So we often have short-term thinking, so no whole life approach to cost or carbon. Conservative design abounds, actually particularly in the sporting environment where peak usage happens only relatively infrequently in the year compared with other occupied building types. Waste, so buildings are crumbling through lack of maintenance and long-term planning, and circular economy principles, which we could have made use of for a long time, were not embedded, and this really challenges future use. So although I'm going to talk about whole life carbon throughout this presentation, I want to kind of highlight the importance of embodied carbon, which if you're talking to a civil or structural engineer is the thing they have most control over. So for context, the materials we predominantly use in the UK when we design and build something are steel and concrete. Obviously we design in other materials too. But if we think about this in the context of worldwide emissions, then if steel and concrete were countries, they'd be the 3rd and 4th biggest carbon emitters, so closely following China and the US. So this is really big. The emissions associated with what we build are enormous, and we really need to urgently address these to get to net zero. So you can reduce carbon at any point in the delivery process, but the opportunities are greater the earlier you start. So clients need to have a good brief, and the design teams, so that's really also including cost consultants, need to be knowledgeable about that whole life approach, and we need to work in a hierarchy of design. So build nothing, challenge that root cause of the need, and explore alternative approaches to achieve the desired outcome. build less, so maximize the use of those existing asset operations and management to reduce the extent of new construction required, and build clever, so design in use of low carbon materials, streamline the delivery process and minimize resource consumption, and then finally build efficiently. So if you're going to build something, you do it as good as you can, embrace new construction technologies and eliminate waste. So this is, I think, from the LETI documentation. I just want to make the point that as we make good moves in reducing our operational energy or decarbonising the grid there, the overall, in terms of whole life carbon, the impact of operational energy starts reducing as a proportion, and embodied carbon becomes more and more important and more urgent for us to address. So, and then just picking this out here, so embodied carbon only, I just want to make the point again here that around 50% of embodied carbon is in the materials we build with to start with, but around 45% is in that maintenance and replacement afterwards. So again, it's really need to be thinking about whole life when we design. So I'm going to talk about all of these things in the context of the velodrome, which was one of the most sustainable projects on the Olympics. So we start with the brief. So of course, any velodrome has two target user groups, those world-class cyclists and the spectators, and then a third group of people, those TV viewers. And for the London 2012 velodrome in particular, there's the fourth set of people, and those are the members of the public and amateur cyclists who will effectively be the main users of the project for most of its life in its legacy stage. So as Dan mentioned with the aquatic centre as well. So we have these kind of two different groups with two very different needs. So cyclists wanting a hot and humid environment, minimal air movement, high levels of light evenly distributed, but they're really only using it kind of 20 days per year, compared with the spectators who are also legacy users wanting something like 18 to 26 degrees, good air movement in the summer, and lower light levels also evenly distributed, but they're using it kind of 345 days in the year. So quite challenged here. So along with the rest of the design team, we were really keen to deliver sustainable design through a building based through true low energy design rather than a reliance on state-of-the-art renewable technologies. So in fact, the velodrome has no in-venue renewables, which I think can be quite surprising for some. So the resulting building easily surpassed the ODA targets, and I think it's generally acknowledged to be the most sustainable venue on the Olympic Park. And in terms of operational energy saving, this included the provision of a highly insulated envelope, a naturally ventilated area, and adequate roof lights that avoided the need for artificial lighting for the majority of its operation. So about 80% of its operation didn't require lights. The ODA required all venues to exceed building regs part L by about 15%, I think it was, and the velodrome exceeds it by about 31%. So embodied carbon, though, presents a kind of more interesting challenge. Targets typically aim to lower the embodied carbon per tonne of material used rather than reduce the total quantities of material used in the construction. So for the design team, kind of with the idea of a racing bike in mind, the design approach followed the desire for lean design throughout, so putting the right material in the right places and removing that unnecessary fat. So the external appearance of the velodrome is that result of kind of shrink wrapping the skin onto the skeleton of the accommodation within. So that minimises the internal volume that in turn needs to be heated, and it reduces the surface area and cost of the cladding. So the roof form is generated by that tight wrapping in the form down on the seating bowl, lifting up at the sides over the upper bowl and pulled down again tightly at the ends where the upper tiers aren't present, leading to that distinctive doubly curved form, or Pringle as you guys might call it. So to make that roof form, from the outset, a cable net roof, which you can see on the right here, was the preferred choice as it lends itself perfectly to the shape and span of that Pringle, providing a combination of strength and lightness. Cable nets also bring programme and construction safety advantages, avoiding the need for scaffolding and temporary propping, and vastly fewer operations carried out on height. And on the left here, I'm kind of showing more the status quo set of trusses. However, early on in that design process, the economic viability of that cable net roof was questioned by the project cost consultants. And this is where it's really important in low carbon design, about kind of understanding what changes we make impact on the carbon. So from the client's perception of additional risk introduced by the relatively rare construction methodology of the cable net, the design team at the time were instructed to adopt a more traditional form, so those trusses, and in response a variety of alternative forms were assessed, so including timber and steel arches. I mean, luckily, the project was procured using a two-stage tender process, and at the time it was REBA Stage C documents that formed that first stage tender pack. We showed a steel arch scheme with the main arch members being of a depth of about 1 metre, so compare that with how little material you're seeing in a cable net. But a supportive contractor, ISG, they identified a 3-month programme benefit with the cable net scheme and was subsequently awarded the contract. So over the course of the next couple of months, the design was significantly modified back to accommodate the reintroduction of the cable net. And that change saved 2,700 tonnes of CO2 equivalent and was successfully completed around 6 months ahead of other venues on the site. So design for long life, low maintenance, really important. So virtually all the vertical faces and soffits were left with a fair face finish to mobilise thermal mass and economy and for general robustness. And timber cassettes were used for the infill roof panels, lightweight, readily prefabricated, with low embodied carbon and structurally appropriate for those small spans between the cable supports. And the underside of each panel was finished in a birch-faced ply, meaning that the internal finish was integral with the panel. So minimising embodied carbon, I mean, the continued tightening of the Part L regulations, like I mentioned before, has forced designers to kind of reduce the operational carbon emissions. And like I said, has had the effect of increasing that relative contribution from the embodied carbon. So therefore, when we're considering low carbon design, the role and influence of the structural engineer do become increasingly important. And the design response for the velodrome focused on this in the following ways. So selecting materials for maximum performance, that's including weight, strength, stiffness, lifespan, thermal mass, embodied energy. Putting structural material in the right place, so lightweight design. Using modern methods of assessment. So for example, using the Institute of Structural Engineers report on crowd dynamics to justify the building as is, rather than stiffening it up to achieve high historic vibration limits, and low carbon material specifications. So for example, specifying concrete with a high cement replacement, and that sort of thing. So I don't have much time to go deep into water design, but I just wanted to make the point that in design and build, we should be putting our efforts into the right places, the places that matter, not doing things that don't really make sense. And an example of this is in water demand. So residential buildings, schools, those sorts of things have a relatively constant use, which you can see in these diagrams. And so does a well-programmed leisure and community centre. But event venues obviously have big peaks and troughs. So where you go for putting in places strategies like rainwater harvesting for the more constant usage requirements, because you'd be able to design in line with a fairly constant usage. I mean, event venues don't offer that same consistency. So with them, it's probably better to focus on efficiency above all else. I mean, that's one for debate. It's, different people have different views on that. So yeah, just to summarize there, so sustainability from every angle. BREEAM, it achieved BREEAM excellence. The energy and carbon efficiency, the CO2 output was about 31% below the building regulations Part L requirement, and we saved those 2,700 tonnes in the roof, sorry, of carbon equivalent in the roof. And water efficiency, so a limited use of rainwater harvesting and efficient fittings meant that it was about 73% below industry standards at the time. So the velodrome's been really well received with the client, the ODA, and obviously the legacy user, the Lee Valley Regional Park Authority. And the building, I suppose, in summary, is a combination of simple technology that cumulatively has produced an exciting building with cycling at its centre, and that's its success. So I want to show something actually now at a different end of the scale, not associated with the velodrome, but thinking about how we design with those kind of peak usage moments. So How often is a stadium fully loaded? I mean, maybe 20 times a year for 90 minutes on a Saturday, something like that. And when we design, there are two key things. We design for strength. We obviously don't want our buildings to fall down, but we also design for stiffness. So what I mean there is kind of movement and comfort. When you're walking on it, do you feel it vibrate? Does it move down significantly when someone loads it? That kind of thing. So obviously we need to put in enough materials to stop a building failing, but we often, particularly on large span structures, and this is where it's particularly relevant to sports systems, we're putting a large amount of material in to increase the stiffness of these buildings, so to stop them moving, to stop them vibrating. But if we make a step change in the way we approach design here, we could do something like use an adaptive system. So just an analogy here, if you were pouring a cup of tea from your kettle and you're pouring that water into the teacup, your arm doesn't rise as the water pours out. Your muscles are constantly adjusting to keep that kettle level. So what you're doing is using an adaptive feedback system to keep the loads regulated and your position in the same place. So with Gennaro Senatore at UCL University, we looked at the opportunity to design an adaptive truss. And here we've got a bunch of actuators in the truss system here. So actuators are just shown here. So think of a simple scissor lift, where these actuators in an expand or contract the structure. So we built a prototype of this, and I think this was a 6 meter long cantilever, about 6 times more slender than it would be otherwise. And you can see here these actuators, which will help change the form of the structure. So I'm just going to show you a little video here. So there's actuators are on, keeping him level. And then when they turned off, so this is how the structure would have deflected if it weren't using this adaptive feedback loop. And there they are back on. So they've corrected for him to be level again. Okay. So that adaptive truss is 80% lighter than a conventional equivalent structure would have been, 6 times more slender. And I hear you shout, but surely it uses operational energy to keep it in place. And of course it does. So, but on a normal use day, the electricity consumption is something like less than a watt, because those actuators and control system only activate for those high infrequent loads. So say a high wind load, or a situation where the stadium is loaded to its full capacity, if you're taking in a sports analogy there. So whole life energy embodied plus operational is 60 to 70% less, and it's because it contains a worm drive system. If there was a power cut, it automatically locks the actuators in place, so there's a fail safe. So I mean, in the broadest terms, the type of projects where adaptive style structures would have real potential are in large span situations, so in sports arenas, for example. So highest levels of deflection or movement control are desired, where extreme slenderness could bring delight, an awe, and a new aesthetic, and where a low weight is needed either for sustainability drivers or perhaps logistics, crane lift, transportation. Now that's quite a high-tech version that I've showed you here, but a low-tech version of it might be where you've got some pretty squishy ground, and you just want to build a bunch of fairly simple foundations. You know, you could just have a monitoring system where you jack those foundations up every so often, and that literally could be a person with a torque wrench doing that. So that's about putting material in the right places. So on to materials separately, just to rush through this. So we are doing, like I said before, I'm working with Network Rail at the moment in low carbon design, and the funding that they are putting into low carbon innovation is fantastic. And one of the things they're doing is kind of putting the proof in the pudding and building, I think it's something like £1 million worth of copers, low carbon copers, but with the stretch target that we can make them net zero, and it looks like we're going to get there with that. And when we do, that's the sort of thing that should be rolled out cross industry. And just to say, I think in innovation in materials, what we need to do is not just say we want to replace like by like. When we discover something new, so in the case here it's earth-friendly concrete, it's a geopolymer concrete, it's got a different kind of strength to it, which means that we might be able to get rid of the reinforcement, which is the thing that often makes structures prematurely degrade if they're not looked after. So actually it's a double benefit, because you've taken out the thing that reduces the life of the system.
Eva, I think we've got about a minute, because we're
yeah. Okay, that's fine. That's my last slide, I think. And then just to say, it's really important in terms of low embodied carbon design to really understand what you're doing when you specify something. Materials come from different places, and there are different fabrication techniques. So that steel beam on the top left actually has the lowest embodied carbon despite using more material, and bottom right, despite using 25% material, has a higher embodied carbon because it comes from a less environmental source, and the way it's been fabricated means it has to be made out of plate rather than rolled steel. So for example, when you think like in architecture or engineering, where you say I'm going to taper my design or make it as materially efficient as possible, it doesn't end up necessarily being as low carbon. So there's a lot to think about, and so those takeaway points are whole life carbon approach, so tackle carbon early, like I said, adopt low carbon principles from day one, be a good client and set a good brief, consider the value of value engineering, so for example in that cable net, ask questions of your design team. And I mean, I would put back to you now, why, if we have many of the answers which Dan's shown, I've shown, and my colleague speaking later today will also say, why are we not deploying them at scale? And that might be an interesting thing to talk about in the chat afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Eva. We're running a bit late, so we're probably going to go on sort of 10-15 minutes beyond our 3 o'clock deadline. I hope that's okay for everybody. I wanted to introduce Jonathan quickly, or hand over to Jonathan. But just, I think in response, the other thing we're thinking about is there's a huge amount of risk actually in many of the things that Eve was talking about, and that's just the nature of innovation. And actually, I think one of the things we haven't really talked about, or Eva hasn't really sort of talked about, is how we overcame risk on the Olympics. It was kind of interesting, but we're not going to pick that up right now. But have that in the back of your mind. You know, you've got to be prepared to kind of test new things if we're really going to meet the big agendas. Anyway, over to Jonathan. You need to stop sharing, I think, Eva.
Okay.
Jonathan, you're okay to share? You're also on mute.
Hello and good afternoon. My name is Jonathan Platt. I'm a director and architect of GCP Chartered Architects in Bristol. We're a small architectural practice based in the Southwest, predominantly working in the Southwest, but occasionally we get opportunities to work wider afield. We've been involved with grassroots community sports since the launch of the Lottery Sports Fund in 1994. At that time, we were working for David Lloyd and a few other commercial operators, but since then our work has predominantly been with grassroots community sports organisations in and around the Southwest, but also occasionally working more on a national basis, principally for the ECB on a number of programmes. There's a couple of things I'd like to talk about principally today, and it's the balance between new build and refurbishment when we're thinking about building back for a better future. My issue here is that actually we've got a huge amount of existing stock that needs attention, and I think we should only really build new when actually we're sure the existing stock has no further purpose. Having said that, we are involved with new build, and the scheme illustrated here was actually the UK's first BREEAM Excellent sports centre in the country, built back in the beginning of this century, and that was funded via the Lottery Sports Fund and the Southwest RDA. The other thing I want to talk about is actually how we fund development going forward. This is going to be extremely difficult post COVID-19, and those are a few of the takeaways I hope to be offering at the end of this talk. So just casting back quickly to 1994, the start of the Lottery Sports Fund. What did we have in terms of grassroots community sports facilities? Well, I think they were pretty underinvested. NGBs were generally only interested in their sport, so football. The FA were interested in football. There wasn't a lot of structure. I think the Lottery Sports Fund drove the need for more strategic investment, and that created challenges for NGBs, which have, largely lots of those plans have been put in place by now. It was run largely by volunteers, and there was just a lack of control. There was a blurring of responsibilities between community clubs and colleges and schools. And that fed into the relationship around who paid for maintenance, etc., etc. Lastly, there was virtually no focus on sustainability. So just casting back to that St. Paul's Sports Academy, the first BREEAM Excellent Sports facility in the country, that was driven by the community consultation we ran and a demand from the community that actually that sports centre should be a sustainable investment for the city. Jumping forward to the start of this year, or pre-COVID-19, what did we have? Well, we still had a massive backlog of maintenance for sports facilities, community sports facilities. This has been estimated to be 3 to 4 billion. Sport England have done lots of work around this. There's not a definitive figure, but it's a big number. And when you look at that in the context of wider government spending, where you've got, I think, about 140 billion on health, about 40, but then down to about 40 billion on defence, 3 to 4 billion in terms of dealing with the backlog of maintenance is not a big ask. Even if we've got $1 billion out of it, what a difference that would make. The NGBs are still largely focused on their sport, although there is more collaboration, and I'll come on to that later. Still heavily reliant on volunteers, and the lack of control of our assets still persists. But the Localism Act has brought forward some good opportunities for clubs to take greater control of their assets. There was a move towards from the beginning of the century in terms of the whole green agenda, and there was lots of lobbying done by lots of organisations, bringing the government to the legislative agenda, and they enacted a number of different proposals over the years, but slowly those things got eroded, and things such as there was a very clear zero carbon agenda that was actually abandoned in 2016. Also, in terms of the funding that's been available at that time, there was not many either carrots or sticks to make people actually, or encourage people to be greener in their investment decisions. So in summary, there was a limited focus on the sustainability agenda at that time. Well, having said that, I think there are reasons to be optimistic. I think Sport England have done some fantastic work in terms of refreshing their guidance around the design of sports facilities. And these two documents are part of a suite of documents around the design of clubhouses. And interestingly, here they focus on refurbishment, which is something I'm going to touch on today, but also the wider sustainability agenda. So I think these are really welcome guides. What is disappointing is when schemes come forward and they make no reference to these. And here's some collaboration between a number of governing bodies supporting Sport England in terms of having a combined view on what a good clubhouse could look like. I think there's been some other really interesting developments by Sport England and their partners, and these are reasons to be optimistic that actually, sport and exercise is a much broader thing, and actually it can be part of everyday life for a far greater group of people. I think the whole idea of active design is something I'm really interested in, and how we can integrate that into our communities. And now we've got some great data, from the facilities planning model, etc., to help us guide guide where our investment might go, or where the country's investment might go. And lastly, the community asset transfer. There is some really helpful guidance there. But the challenge is actually seeing that through and ensuring anybody who takes on an asset transfer isn't actually unduly compromised by the transfer process. I mentioned earlier that actually there'd been lots of lobbying and persuasion of government to put the green agenda higher within the legislative calendar. Well, despite all the lobbying and years of pressure groups, it took a teenager from Sweden to put climate change on the agenda. This is now a global movement. Her tenet was actually current commitments are inadequate, and she used peaceful persuasion and brought young people out on the streets, which was a really interesting thing to see. So climate change is now on the agenda. It is even more, it was brought even more to focus over the last couple of years with Extinction Rebellion and the direct action rather than the quiet persuasion of Greta. These campaigns cannot be ignored if you're in central London. So it's really on the agenda now, and governments are starting to take note. The other thing that actually I think has had a massive impact, and we're seeing it now in terms of local authority investment decisions, was the whole climate declarations that started in Australia. But actually, Bristol, interestingly, was the first UK city to declare a climate emergency, and now more than 400 civic authorities have taken up the campaign. Interestingly, I think a climate emergency now trumps planning policy in terms of driving local authorities' decision making. This is now a mainstream agenda at long last. And lastly, just bringing it back to buildings, because that's what we're here talking about. Well, the RIBA main prize, the most important prize in the country for architectural design, went to not a high-profile, shiny new building in a city centre, but to a council housing project in Norwich. This scheme won the Sterling Prize 2019, and a key aspect of this was that it was built to the Passive House Energy benchmarking standard, and the second thing was it involved huge amounts of community consultation. We've noticed that actually this project is being referenced by local authorities around the country in terms of their house building agenda. Question I pose to you is, could this apply to sport next? So those were some reasons to be optimistic. There are some reasons to be a little bit pessimistic. You know, the challenge of COVID-19 for people and getting exercise has been a real problem. And as you can see from this Sport England research, that actually activity levels have really shrunk for some key groups. But it's also a threat to organisations. So it's not just individuals' activity levels, but are people going to go back to clubs? Are the people going to go back to clubs and pay their membership to allow those clubs to keep the doors open and the lights on? But having said that, maybe it also forces us to think about things a little bit differently. The high street isn't going to go back to what it was before. So why should community and grassroots sports go back to what it was before? Maybe there's an opportunity to think about how things are organised and whether we can do things better. So I've got a couple of case studies here that I'd just like to quickly run past you. This is a new build case study, which I think is a bit about old thinking. It was built in 2006, based on limited consultation within the city of Bristol, single NGB focus, not in a part of the city was a little bit difficult for people to access, and it was typical of a little bit of a kind of silo thinking, as I describe it. It was a top-down, not a bottom-up solution. Really disappointingly, post 2006, they then realised to make it work, they needed to put floodlights in for evening training. But despite that, it closed in 2018. It now operates as a gym, and it's almost impossible to book out to use those 2 grass pitches and the rubber crumb ATP. So that's what it looks like today. Club rooms being taken over for a gym, and the clubhouse is basically unused for anything other than a gym off a dual carriageway, with all the demolition materials from the works that were undertaken about a year ago still sitting in the car park. It's not a great environment to go and park up and use a gym, and it's just a bit of bad investment in my mind. Moving on to something that I think is a better example of investment, and it's something fortunately that we've been involved with, and I think this is about refurbishment, and it's about new thinking, and it's about looking at assets that are already within communities and looking at them and appraising them and saying, well, actually, you know, if they're not quite right for today, what do we need to make them better for tomorrow? So here we took we worked with a client, which was Waltham Forest Borough Council, and the ECB, England and Wales Cricket Board. And this was the first project where the ECB's urban cricket programme was introduced. One of the key tenets of this project was to actually build in maximum flexibility. We were involved with phases 1, 2 and 3. Phase 4, the cricket pavilion is going to be converted into a food hub, and the table tennis hall likewise. The phase 2, an arts block, which is a former school's arts block, that was brought into the project, and it was delivered with a kind of a multi-agency, multi-NGB contribution. It put the community at the heart. It looked at how could this site deliver more to the community than it did historically. Historically, there was little sporting activity on the site and virtually no community activity. The vision for the site was actually to have it active from 7 in the morning till 10 at night. It's going to be a long program. Phase 2, or phase 1 and phase 2 have been delivered. Phase 1, 2 and 3 have been delivered, sorry. Phase 4 is subject to a heritage lottery grant, which is in development. It was a really interesting project in that actually we were trying to bring together 2 buildings that had 2 dissimilar previous functions, and what we were trying to do was make the whole site more viable and a better asset for the future. This is the site when we arrived. Main pavilion on the left-hand side, the arts block, and the sports hall on the right. On the left, we've got the existing sports hall and former arts building. With the pink is just the bits we were going to build as new build to link them together. And the right is the early stage sketch scheme proposals around how we would integrate those 2 buildings together, bringing as many different uses into those 2 buildings so we have occupancy throughout the day. Sports hall as it was and as it is today. The sports hall on the right links through the 3 glazed doors on the left-hand side into the arts block. So there's a physical and visual connection between the 2. With a little bit of work, we transformed the showers, and there we are at the end of the day. A bit of a light touch external transformation, but actually the money was spent indoors. This is another project that we're involved with, whereby this is a community asset transfer to a sports organisation based in Bristol. This has been a social club for years and years and years. The last investment was in the 1980s, and despite the pitches being fantastically well maintained, the buildings are pretty poor. And the building is in desperate need of investment. The tricky thing here is where is the club going to get the money? It's a great site on the River Avon, great opportunity. At the moment, it just really focuses on football. There's not much else in terms of sporting activity on the site, but historically there've been tennis and cricket. And there is a relatively active external grass bowls area. Within the building, there is opportunity to create more sports facilities, and the club are very keen to expand the daytime offer in terms of creating a community club, community hub, whereby there could be a creche, co-working, and other kind of activities that would bring people there during the day. They also want to add some gym facilities, and it's just looking at what they could do to expand their offer, maybe beyond their red line boundary into the areas adjacent, where on the right-hand side, the rewilding and nature hides, just bringing more people to the site, and on the left-hand side, in terms of creating a recreation garden, which actually just generates more reasons why more people might come to the site and use their facilities. The tricky thing is where they're going to get the money. Well, there are some flood defence works that are proposed along the River Avon, and interestingly, in Bristol there is policies around the letting of public service contracts, where there's a social value calculator they use. And actually, if we can get written into the contract documents that actually all the contractors need or could use this site for their construction compound, not in terms of materials, but in terms of welfare for all the workers, the cafe and coffee shop within the club could benefit from serving meals, you know, breakfasts and lunches. That would make a huge difference to the club. Also, there's opportunities around taking spoil from the construction works and using it to level the playing fields, which actually suffer from flooding. This is I think my last case study. This is a club we've been involved with, and this is where I play my squash ball, now racquetball. The club has been around. It's the oldest club. It used to be called Bristol Lawn Tennis Club. It then moved to being called Bristol Lawn Tennis and Squash Club. It's now they've now changed the name to Redland Green Club. What they wanted was to actually have something that was a more inclusive offer and not an exclusive offer. As you can see, the site has shrunk over the years. The three white blobs on the right-hand picture are blocks of flats that have been built on land that was previously the tennis club. So the difficulty here is this is in a relatively leafy part of Bristol, North Bristol, not likely to be a recipient of millions of pounds from the Sport England through any lottery application. So where else are they? How else are they going to fund this other than going to their members, which they've done on a few times in the past? So that is the real challenge. The club was a pre-Wimbledon venue when it was all grass courts, and as we can see at the bottom now, some of the grass courts have been taken out of use and are completely unplayable. There's been extremely complex land ownership over the years because the club has been in lots of different owners, and they previous owners thought they were going to be able to secure the site for residential development when the club failed. Well, fortunately, through the works of members over the years, they've managed to wrestle back control. They're now going through the final stages of changing the legal structure for this club to ensure it will be held for the benefit of members in perpetuity. But it's been a long journey to secure the rights to control their future. Really interestingly, out of the I think 13 courts they have, 5 are unplayable on the left-hand side. They're still surfaced as grass. Of the remaining 8 courts, only 5 are to LTA standards. There's a real issue between the connection between the club and the courts, where actually you had to walk across the car park. Historically, it was predominantly a members club and predominantly adults. Now, juniors far outweigh the adult members, and it's really important that actually the environment is safe for juniors, and it isn't at the moment. There's a first floor bar and a recreation area which overlooks some of the courts, but it actually has no viewing of the squash whatsoever, apart from a small balcony. And there's no covered tennis for winter use. And having 2 David Lloyd clubs in Bristol, or 3 David Lloyd clubs in Bristol, 2 of which have covered tennis, this is an issue for any private or community club in the city. So in line with local authorities thinking, the club, we wrote a strategic development plan for the club, which looked at a 50-year horizon. How do we make this club good for the next 50 years? So the strategic brief has been used to guide all decision-making. And the decision was there was going to have to be some selective land sales to be able to fund the investment needed to secure the club for future generations. The focus of the strategic brief was that actually we should look to reuse and refurbish wherever possible. So i.e. not building outside the existing the envelope of the existing building, and focus on making the existing building work better and work harder throughout the day. And we were going to do that by overcladding the building, filling the roof with PVs, moving the recreation area from the first floor to the ground floor, allowing that out to open out into the area where the car park was, and create more direct connection between the the social areas and the playing areas, both for the tennis, but also for the squash. So in summary, what can we do to bring forward better investment in terms of sport? So these are my questions to you. How can we use the climate emergency declarations to actually drive investment decisions by local authorities? If you don't know if the local authority has declared a climate emergency, please go and find out. Another issue I've come across, well, how can we tie planning obligations to higher standards? And hopefully the other presentations within this session will help answering some of that. Also, how can we incentivize the payouts from 106 or SIL to insist on higher standards? Can we link those payouts to local authorities where they've declared a climate emergency? How can we lobby for investment to be tied to higher performance standards? Do we do that through working with the NGBs? Do we do that by lobbying our politicians? I don't know. I'm not sure what the best route is that, but actually we need to tie investment in sport and leisure to higher environmental performance. I think we can build back better, but only with a more collaborative and shared vision on what that future might look like. Finally, I think underused buildings can't be sustainable buildings. So there are lots of buildings out there that only get used once or twice a week. We need to have more people using more sports buildings more often. Thank you, and I look forward to discussing these points later.
Really kind of, as Vicky, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Okay, yeah. I think what's kind of really shocking though about that is the sort of this huge disconnect, seems to me, between this obesity crisis and the sort of health crisis we have, and then the sort of story that Jonathan sort of tells, which, you know, and that it seems to me we're really not building the value case. You know, it's kind of, it's all about cost and not about value. Anyway, over to Vicky.
Okay, thank you. Is it possible to share screens? Sorry, I'm not able to share my slides.
Sorry, hang on.
That's all right. I'll start talking and I'll try again in a second. Hi everybody, thank you Dan and Basis for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to look at the positive things that planners are doing to encourage more sustainable development. Oh, great. The slide's working for me now, I'll just bring those up. Can you see my slides?
Yep.
Yes.
Great. Anyway, a little bit about me. I'm Vicky Aston. I'm Principal Planning Policy Officer for South Oxfordshire District Council and the Vale of Wiseman Horse, where I work on developing planning policies. Before I joined the council, some of you might know that I was a planning manager for 10 years at Sport England, where I worked closely with national governing bodies and local authorities to use the planning system to help protect playing fields and deliver new sports facilities through planning contributions and through planning policies and strategies. So I'm going to tell you now about some of the positive planning policies that are being developed by my councils and others to encourage more sustainable buildings. And I'll also speak about emerging areas of policy development, including healthy place shaping. But first, Dan also speak about some of the challenges, and I see these as that for delivering green and sustainable buildings, particularly for sport. And these would be, for me, that green buildings can be expensive to deliver for community sports group, that planning authorities will vary on their approach to tackling climate change, and the planning system can be very difficult to navigate for those unfamiliar with planning. These planning policies take time to come through as well, and they need to be evidenced, and that takes time, which is why we don't see them come through as quickly, as Jonathan just mentioned in his talk. And in particular, a development also has to be viable, and this can sometimes mean that changes that support sustainability can be taken out of schemes later in the process by developers submitting further planning applications. There is good news to report in that there are policies in the National Policy Framework that encourage new development to consider climate change, but they are pretty broad in scope, and they encourage rather than say that you have to undertake this. But on the positive news front, we've heard we heard earlier and on previous basis seminars that local authorities have been declaring climate emergencies, and now there are quite a number of them that are developing planning policies to help encourage more sustainable buildings, and in some cases even insist on them. And good examples are the emerging London Plan, Oxford City, Salford, Reading, the London Borough of Richmond, and our own council's draft South Oxfordshire Plan. The TCPA and RTPI have also been publishing guidance to help local authorities understand on how they can better encourage this. And there's a document called Rising to the Climate Crisis, which is helpful. And neighbourhood plans can also set policies to attract climate change and ensure that planning policies that in the future major new sports facilities will deliver and meet environmental standards like the one we heard about earlier on, some of the examples we heard about earlier in the presentation. I'll just quickly tell you about the draft London, for example, the draft London Plan requirements now include that major development should contribute to the greening of London by including urban greening as a fundamental element of site and building design, for example, green roofs and green walls. And one of the other examples from that I just mentioned in South Oxfordshire, for example, in their draft policies, large non-residential development proposals are required to meet the BREEAM Excellent standard, in addition to achieving at least a 40% reduction in the carbon emissions compared with the 2030 building regulation base case. And that was taken from the Oxford City policy, which is adopted. And in both cases, the councils had to evidence at their hearings that this would be viable for developers to deliver. So it's much more difficult for them to get out of delivering on that standard. And it would apply to large sports developments that met the criteria, such as non-residential over 1,000 square metres. As I mentioned, neighbourhood plans can also set that type of policy. And another emerging policy area is that Eva mentioned earlier, was the circular economy, which is aimed at eliminating waste and the continual use of resources, which is of course the alternative to a traditional linear economy. And the draft London Plan is requiring large development, some large development applications to submit a circular economy statement, and the Mayor is developing guidance on circular economy as well. So that's definitely a key area that's been coming forward. And now I just wanted to mention, of course, in relation to policies, that the government's currently intending a radical overhaul of the planning system, and there isn't time to go into that here. But we'll have to wait to see if things change and more requirements come in to encourage BREEAM Excellent standards or Passive House or similar through national guidance. Certainly the government has said that they will have an environmental consultation in the autumn, and that they will update the NPPF, so we may see changes coming quite soon. And it's also worth mentioning that the national planning policy, that there's proposals as well to move from the national infrastructure levy, to a national infrastructure levy rather than local authorities setting them themselves. So again, that could mean less money potentially going into sport. We'll just have to wait and see. So before I finish, I just wanted to speak about sporting and design guidance, and Jonathan's already kind of mentioned the really good sustainability clubhouse note. Just to pick up on the Sport England design guidance, active design guidance, which is 10 principles to promote active health and stronger communities, and that's the diagram for that that you can see on screen. A lot more work is emerging in this policy sphere to encourage physical activity, walking and cycling in the built environment, and that's what the active design principles are all about encouraging. And includes these, particularly encouraging walkable communities, collective walking and cycling routes, and so on, that you can see on the slide. I also wanted to mention as well that Sport England's also partnered with BRE, so that when BREEAM assessments take place on major housing developments, developers can score additional points by meeting some of the active design principles. So you can find that on their website if you Google active design Sport England. But I just wanted to mention that on the Oxfordshire 2050 plan, they've got a similar idea, which is embedding what they call healthy place shaping. And this is a similar idea to creating the 15-minute or 20-minute neighbourhood approach that you've been hearing about in the news, in terms of planning new communities and that will address climate change, active travel, active design, and locating community facilities all within easy reach with each other in new development. And so that's what these sort of documents are all about, encouraging through planning policy, thinking about these things in design and insisting that developers do them. Good. Okay. Well, that was all the main points I wanted to run through, because I was conscious we were short on time. So I'm happy to answer any. Hope you found that useful. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Vicky, that was really helpful, and thanks for providing some planning context. I mean, I feel a little bit pessimistic, but also optimistic. I feel pessimistic because to some extent I still think, and having spent so much time, not just on the Olympics, but in trying to build a kind of legacy, you know, that sport, particularly community sport, is still kind of undervalued and underfunded, you know, and yet I think, and one of the things for me that COVID has really sort of shown, but I think we've kind of known this for a long time, that we have a health crisis, that sport has a huge role to play from a social perspective. I think we shouldn't just think about this as an environmental kind of agenda in terms of health, and actually a sort of the community sort of hub, sort of things that, you know, Jonathan was sort of alluding to. I think, how do we kind of bring sport back into these facilities back in? I think that we can't just deal with the kind of the carbon. I think we have to start with the kind of the cost and the efficiency. And I think there are kind of really compelling reasons around whole life cost to kind of build more sustainably. Then I think there's an amazing sort of amount of innovation that Eva was sort of showing that we ought to be kind of like really picking up on, because it can kind of talk to so many different agendas, including climate. And actually delight, you know, and so optimistically, I think we can just do so much more. We can rethink this. Kind of pessimistically, I just sort of worry that we're still stuck in a kind of this, you know, just a slightly kind of failed sort of approach to sort of sport. So I think we've got to get that right. But I'd love to open this up to questions. So audience, are there any questions out there?
You can either raise your hand on the reactions button and we can go to you and you can ask the question yourself, or you can come through on the chat.
There was one question, I think, from Peter Watts on what you all achieved at the Olympic Park is awesome. Does it bug you that the media focus is always on the main stadium and its legacy issues? I think what actually bugs me much more is that, and I met up with some people that I work with, was how optimistic we were in 2012 and kind of what's happened to us in the last 8 years and kind of where we've got to now. But I also think, so I mean, actually I think that the Olympics got sort of some really good press. I'm also a little bit, I think what bugs me is that we learned so much actually about, and we kind of delivered the project in a completely different way. And I look at so many projects that just don't get the whole life approach. I know it was a privileged project, but actually it paid back in spades. You know, it's contributed to London, it contributed to the UK and its kind of image, it contributed to East London, which was particularly kind of poor. If you look at the 4 boroughs, they were amongst the poorest in the UK. It's contributed to, you know, to all sorts of cultural sort of change, and it's growing still. 2 universities on the park. So I actually think, yeah, there was a kind of focus on the stadium. I think it was almost kind of inevitable. The media works in that way, but I think there was a tremendous legacy, and I kind of really would love it if that kind of that legacy was picked up, and the powers that be kind of understood actually the power of sport to sort of transform, and the importance of parks and green spaces and the sort of things that Vicky was talking about, and that we started to kind of pick up on some of Jonathan's agendas, really rethinking how we kind of put these wasted facilities back at the heart of things. And I don't think it should be on a tight budget. I think it should be in recognition of the kind of value this all places. There's a kind of, I think there's another question about soft landings, which I think absolutely, I think soft landings is a hugely important. I don't know how many people understand what soft landings are, but it's the sort of, too often we build projects, some contractor builds them, hands over the keys, and somebody sort of operates them. There is no process for actually kind of working with the eventual operators and thinking about how that building will kind of, how it will be used, what the kind of performance specifications, and then making sure that as you kind of get closer to the kind of handover, that the team that are going to take it over really understand how to get the most out of it. So I think it's absolutely right that soft landings has to be a part of a kind of wider sustainability thinking. How do we convince major sporting bodies to include sustainable buildings into their bids for future events? I don't know if anybody wants to take that on from the panel, or any of the other two questions.
You're the expert on that one, Dan, probably.
How do you convince major sporting bodies to, I mean, gosh, if seeing, I mean, clearly seeing isn't believing. It's kind of really interesting. I kind of contrast in a way the kind of the velodrome with the aquatic centre, which uses 4 times as much embodied carbon, and actually is much more expensive to maintain. I think we have to convince them by demonstrating that it's not just a planet, a sort of an intangible carbon agenda. I guess I think we have to sort of demonstrate that building a sustainable building, which at its heart is actually building a building that will last, that's to sustain, kind of where the word comes from, that will require minimum maintenance, that will use as little energy as possible, that will provide a heart for a community, that will that's adaptable, that provides ideally sort of from looking at that provides more than one sport, actually brings together different sports, that brings the whole sporting community together, but the wider community. I think if we can get that kind of right, and we kind of really, for me in the end, I think we can sell the kind of value proposition rather than a kind of just what will it cost and can we afford it proposition. If we can connect those sporting facilities and sustainable building with health and well-being, and as I said, the whole sort of health crisis that we have with obesity, with an inclusion and and the diversity issues, and not just the kind of, it's the Black Lives Matter agenda. I think we really have to understand that there are many other agendas that sport can address. For me, I think we kind of have to understand and position sport in at the heart of all of that, in the same way. And I think together with culture, actually, I think it's and we have to demonstrate that as shopping dies because we're buying online, and as offices die, we need to kind of rejuvenate our centres, and I think this is part of that agenda. So I would kind of build this case around a kind of value proposition. And I see far too many big developments, actually, contrary to kind of maybe what Vicky was saying, in London, but elsewhere, that just don't have enough green space. The leisure centre, etc. kind of things we'll do if we have to do them. If somebody kind of bothers to force us, they're not recognised as sort of being really brilliant hubs actually for community building in these new long-term developments. So I just think we got to get a new perspective on all of this. Does that help, Fern?
It's David Lettany, actually. He's
Okay.
hiding behind Fern's iPad. Yeah, actually, just to add something to what you're saying there, and from a recreational sport point of view, and Jonathan and I have talked about this quite often, about the governing bodies, and then we're talking here about Sport England in particular, using the principles of awarding funding into the recreational game in particular, and tying those to sustainable design principles being part of that. But there are a number of issues that sit around that in how do you police it and how do you implement it and the rest of it. But possibly that's the stick and carrot that Jonathan mentioned. That's something that perhaps needs to be addressed in a bit more with a bit more thought and I think seriousness if they do genuinely want to embed sustainability.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most interesting things I think is the whole outdoor gym. This idea that NHS doctors, etc., give you a prescription to go out and use these facilities. Those sorts of things. I think building those sort of connections. And the NHS, we know, is kind of has been the sort of, it was the unsung, and now it's the sort of the sung hero, if you like, of the last 10 months of pandemic, and actually aligning with that and building those sorts of coalitions, I think could be really powerful.
Okay, if no one else has any more questions, I think we'll probably wrap it up there.
Sorry.
Sorry. Yep.
Can I just ask? Hi. Can I just ask a question, really, about? It's kind of directed to Vicky, really, about planning and the pressure on local authorities that local authorities will come under to sell land for development. I mean, in my own area alone, I live in Luton in Bedfordshire. The local council have just sold some land for development that was actually a protected sports playing site. And although there is a replacement site, it's actually a lot smaller on the facility of a local college. And I mean, having sat through the planning committee, there didn't seem much of an imperative by the council to protect that site. It was traded off for a shiny new college. And I think that a lot of smaller local authorities that are perhaps less progressive are going to come under increasing pressure because of they don't have the finances, they're not generating the levels of income. So I guess it's kind of how the new planning rules will kind of help councils kind of to protect those sites, or at least empower people to actually challenge councils to protect those sites.
Thanks. Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, I was at Sport England before, where we spent a lot of time trying to protect playing fields from development. I do understand some of I can't comment on directly on what you've just mentioned, but of course there is a pressure on local authorities to release sites, and I've seen that in the planning reforms. But on the positive side, I would say that the government doesn't seem to have any intention of taking away Sport England's. Well, sorry, the government is pro-sport, I would say, and you can still use the local green space designation as well to protect that type of playing field, like the green spaces. So that's if you can bring local green spaces through neighbourhood plans as well as local plans. That's something that communities can look at to try and protect their spaces. So I would urge you to look at that. But it's difficult to comment on what the outcome of the planning reforms will be at the moment. I certainly agree with you. It is disappointing that I think that local authorities are aware of their obligations to protect spaces as well for the community, and there hasn't been any. I feel that there's quite a lot in the planning reforms to be cheerful about, in that they want to get people more from the community more involved in the planning system. So in answer to your question, I think that if people want to, that there will be opportunities through the planning reforms to continue to protect open spaces, despite there being challenges.
I think,
is that helpful?
I think it's a really well made point. I think the kind of reality has been for too long that we've lost, you know, important kind of facilities. I think also local authorities have been, you know, have lost more money under the last 10 years of austerity than virtually any other bit of society, which makes it doubly sort of difficult. And we also know that the biggest agenda for the government actually is to build housing, you know, and that needs land. So, you know, I think that we've got to kind of work really hard to kind of impress upon local authorities, planners, government, the essential role that this plays, and what happens when you build denser and denser development, but you provide less and less sort of open space. Something's got to give. And I often think that Sports England, I think they've done a great job. I think they don't have an important enough place at the table. You know, I think that we've got to, in a way, that's got to be beefed up. But I think there's an opportunity, because I think that a lot of the traditional kind of town centre and town components, you know, development components are under question. As I said, offices, we're moving away from sort of centralised offices, shopping, etc. And actually, I think it's culture and sport which will kind of begin to sort of fill, you know, and give purpose to the sort of centres of town. So we need to I think there's a kind of an opportunity, but the green spaces as well, I think have to be a really important part of this. I think we kind of understand that more probably than we have before, and I think one of the interesting things that you should look out for are the new design guides, which are going to be published as a complement to the NPPF, probably by the end of this month. You know, and that's a kind of a forward signal from the government. It's guidance, so it's not policy, but it'll have strong weight in making planning decisions. But it does recognise the importance of sustainability, of green space, of health as part of the whole building back better, or, you know, planning reform, if you like, which will take longer to kind of enact. Difficult. It's a really good question, and it's a difficult one to answer. It's a difficult one to sort of address fully.
Great. Thank you, Dan. Thank you very much. We've done really well. So done a good 25 minutes over, but it was a really interesting discussion. I think it was vibrant, and it covered all the kind of challenges that we face within sport in terms of building back better, how we build back better sustainably. So thank you to the panel, and thank you to Dan for taking on the leading role in it. I really appreciate it. You took it on and ran it really well. And thank you to to Eva and Jonathan and Vicky for bearing through the slight overrun. And thank you to everybody out there for coming along to our webinars every week. We run them monthly now, and the next one we will be announcing shortly. But the idea is we want to keep the sporting community connected and talking to each other. And, you know, when we bring in people like engineers and architects, it's really important that they connect up with the rest of the community. So thank you all, and hopefully we'll see you all in a week's time.